Hi, this is Dan from the Kuhn Laboratories here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm currently the primary developer of Argonaut, a web-based platform which you can use to share your mass spectrometry-based omics data with collaborators around the world in a secure manner. So, setting up websites can be pretty tricky, especially if you don't have much experience in managing web resources. So I've put together this tutorial as a guide for how to set up an instance of Argonaut on Amazon Web Services using Docker. So I hope that this guide will be a great first step towards you implementing Argonaut and exploring your omics data with your collaborators using our platform. So just to give a quick overview of what's contained in this tutorial video, first we're going to launch a Linux virtual machine on AWS, and then we're going to open up this VM to internet traffic so that you can use your new Linux VM as a web server to host Argonaut. Next, we're going to connect to your new VM using either an SSH client, or in this tutorial, we're going to do it through the web browser. Next, we're going to install Docker onto your VM, and then finally, we're going to pull an image of Argonaut off of Docker Hub, and we're going to launch a new instance of Argonaut on your web server so that you can then host your data and share it with your collaborators. So before we dive into this video too much, first you're going to need to set up an AWS account at the link shown here. So just a quick disclaimer, when you're setting up a new account, you're going to need to provide credit card information because at the end of the day, AWS is a paid service. To the best of my ability, I put together this guide using the free tier options as of August 2020, but please be mindful if you go and use these services beyond the scope of this tutorial, you may get some charges charged to the credit card that you used if you exceed the free tier limits of the AWS services. So just read those beforehand if you want to do anything above and beyond what's contained in this guide. So when I ran through this myself, I wasn't charged anything. So let's jump into it. Now I've logged in to my Amazon account that I made earlier today. And what we're going to want to do first is, after you signed in, you're going to want to sign into the console. So in this case, these are all the services that you can launch from your new Amazon account once you've authenticated and everything. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to launch a virtual machine using EC2 from the Build a Solution pane here. So then next, there's a bunch of options on what type of virtual machine you can spin up. What we're kind of focused on here in the tutorial are these free tier eligible services. In particular, we're interested in this Amazon Linux 2 AMI HVM SD volume type. So we're going to select that. I would double check that 64-bit x86 is checked instead of the 64-bit ARM. We're going to select that. And there's a bunch of different, essentially, sizes of virtual machines that you can launch. So there's only one free tier eligible one, called this T2 Micro that's already selected. If you're actually trying to spin up a version of Argonaut on AWS that you want to use actually with collaborators and external to this guide, I would select something with more cores. So in this case, our T2 Micro here has one virtual CPU, 1 gigabyte of RAM, and then it doesn't have any included storage. So if you wanted to pay, you can definitely launch bigger servers that have, solid state drives, 48 cores, but that's above and beyond what we're interested for this guide. So we're going to stick to this T2 Micro free tier eligible, 1 gigabyte of RAM, 1 virtual CPU, and we're going to click Review and Launch. And there's a bunch of details here. We really don't need to worry about these at this point in time. It all should be good. We'll click Launch, and then it's going to ask us to create a new public key and private key. So these key pairs essentially are a way that you can securely connect your computer to your virtual machine. It's like a lock and a key, and it's to prevent, security breaches. So since we don't have one currently created, we're going to create a new key pair. And you can call this whatever you want. I'm going to call it my new key. And you're going to need to download it. And this in particular is really useful if you want to eventually access your virtual machine externally to a web browser. But in this case, I'm just going to save it to my desktop. When you're actually doing this, I would save it somewhere more secure. If you have like a dedicated SSH key folder, I would save it there. But again, for the case of this tutorial, I think saving it to the desktop is fine. So now that we've downloaded the key, we can launch the instance. So this is actually going to create the Linux virtual machine on AWS. So now we've done that, instance is now launching. Sometimes this can take a couple minutes, but at least in my case, it can go pretty quick. So right now we're stuck at pending, so we're going to wait for a little bit. But in the meantime, we can move on to step 2. Now that we've started a virtual machine, we need to figure out a way to let this virtual machine be generally accessible to the internet at large. So we're going to go to the security groups tab here from the instance management dashboard. And we're going to click the security group launch wizard 2 because we're going to want to add one entry here. So in this case, when you launch a virtual machine, by default, there are these things called inbound rules, which allow connections to the virtual machine to happen. When you launch a new virtual machine, by default, it lets you do SSH connections into it. We're also, in order to let this virtual machine act as a web server, we're also going to need to, let's see, where do I click? I click here, Actions, and we're going to click Edit Outbound Rules. And what we're going to need to do is we're going to add a rule, and we're going to say allow internet traffic, which is this HTTP, which is Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And this essentially opens up a port, number 80, to receive internet traffic. And then we're also going to want to click 0000 to let it be accessible anywhere in the world. If you want to be more restrictive, say, I only want to allow connections from a certain number of, a certain range of IP addresses, you can define that here, but we're not going to get into that at this point in time. So we're going to save that, and it looks like it went through. So we're going to go back to our dashboard, and now we see that our instance state is running. So our virtual machine is up and going. And one thing that I want you to note right now is there's a couple columns here. There's public DNS IPv4. This is essentially the web address that you can plug into your browser later on that allows you to access your running version of Argonaut. So you either can use this DNS version, which is kind of readable, or you can use this IP address. Both work, but at a later date, in a more official capacity, you can update this public DNS version with an actual web address. So like argonaut.com. To connect to the instance, we can click this connect button here. There's a couple options. If you have SSH client already installed on your computer, you can use that, the private key that you downloaded, and the public DNS address or the IP address right there. But in our case, just because it's right here, we're going to use this EC2 instance connect. Now it's important, just for simplicity's sake, I'm using a username called EC2-user. I would recommend that you do this too, but really you can call this user anything that you want. Just be consistent throughout the rest of the steps. So if you change it, make sure that you change it throughout the rest of the steps in this guide. Okay, so we're going to connect, and this is going to launch a terminal window to our virtual machine. So we're going to have to run a couple command line commands in this case. So just note that if you're unfamiliar with running things in the terminal is case sensitive. So try to type what I'm typing. So in this case, we're going to first update the virtual machine's installed packages. So we type in sudo, which stands for super user do, yum, which is the package manager, update, and then we're going to give it this Y flag, which means say yes to updating all packages that need to be updated. So it's going to go, it's going to think. This might take a little bit, but we'll let it go. All right, it's done. Next, we're going to install Docker. All right, so I accidentally closed out of the terminal window there. So we're going to start over from updating the packages. So we're going to type in sudo yum update yes to force all updates. So it updated. And then next, we're going to install Docker. So we go sudo Amazon Linux extras install Docker. So this should install Docker. So it's going to think a little bit. We're going to say yes there. It's asking us if we want to actually install it. It's going. Wonderful. So now we have Docker installed. So now we want to see if we can actually start Docker, or sudo service Docker start. So Docker is now running on our computer. So just because typing sudo over and over and over is a little annoying, we're going to change some user permissions, and we're going to let EC2 user, the user account that we logged into, and we're going to give it some Docker permission so we don't have to keep on typing sudo. So we're going to go sudo user mod -a capital G Docker and then EC2 user. I'm going to run that. And then to actually let this save, we're going to have to close out of the terminal window, and we're going to have to reconnect. We're going to reconnect again under the same username. And then just to make sure that this is actually, the user permissions worked, and we don't need to keep on typing sudo, we're going to go docker info, and if it worked, it's going to show a bunch of settings, text. If it didn't work, you're going to get an error that says something like cannot connect to the Docker daemon. Is a Docker daemon running on this host? And in that case, you might actually have to reboot your virtual machine instance, but that's not that big of a deal. In this case, it works, so we're not going to have to worry about that too much. Now we have Docker installed. What we can do is we can pull a pre-configured version of Argonaut off of Docker Hub, which is a repository of pre-configured Docker images, and then we can launch that Docker image of Argonaut into a container, which is essentially a little virtual machine inside, the virtual machine that you just spun up, and it should run Argonaut completely configured right out of the gate without you having to think about it too much. So pulling Argonaut is super easy. All you need to do is type a couple words, docker pull, which pulls an image, coonlabs.argonaut or /argonaut. By default, this pulls the latest version of Argonaut's image from Docker Hub. If you want to be more specific, we want to pull version 2.0, but in this case, we're just going to pull the latest version. So now Docker is downloading the Docker image from the repository. It's going to take a little bit. It's going to have to uncompress it. All right, perfect. So now that the Docker image has been pulled and unzipped, we're going to check to make sure that it was actually pulled the one that we wanted. So if you type in Docker images, it gives a list of all the images that you pulled. And in this case, we see that there's the repository Argonaut, tag latest, image ID is just a unique identifier created a while ago with a virtual size of 2.21 gigabytes. It doesn't actually take up that much space on disk, but it's good to keep in mind. So now that we have the Docker image and we know it's there, we can actually spin up an instance into a container of Argonaut by typing in the following command: docker run in the argument p8080. So what that basically is saying is I want to take any incoming traffic to my virtual machine on port 80 and give it to Argonaut's web server, which also receives traffic on port 80. So you're basically handing off incoming web traffic to your virtual machine into Docker, into Argonaut. In this case, you can call your container anything that you want. I'm going to call it Argonaut. And then finally, you're going to want to specify the image name. So in this case, coonlabs, plural, /Argonaut. So now you have a version of Argonaut running. Great. So that's all you need to do in the terminal. So you can take that, and then if you take the address here and you plug it into the web browser bar, I have Google Chrome open right now. Wonderful. Argonaut comes with one user account pre-configured. The user account is guest, the username is guest, and the password is password with a lowercase p, so PASSWORD, and you can click login. So you might, with a guest user account, you might get this alert from Google Chrome that says check your passwords, a data breach has exposed your password. Don't worry about it. You can add other user accounts that are more secure than guest at this point. So, so hopefully you found this guide useful. So just to recap, in this guide, we first set up a virtual machine on Amazon Web Services or AWS. Next, we connected to the instance of, we connected to a virtual machine and we installed Docker. We opened up a virtual machine's web traffic port so we can use our virtual machine as a web server. And then finally, we pulled the Argonaut Docker image off of Docker Hub, and then we launched a new container that runs Argonaut. And then here we are seeing Argonaut, at least in action in this case, a completely empty new project ready for you to create user accounts, upload data, and share access with your collaborators. So I wanted to thank you all for tuning in, and if you have any questions, feel free to go send me an email or go to our GitHub and ask some questions there. Have a great day.